In this video, we're going to talk about complex numbers. This is actually going to end up being a part of our conversation about polynomials. You will notice that so far, all of the polynomials that we've looked at have had real zeros, real roots. Sometimes all rational, sometimes some rational, some irrational, but always real. So by opening up the conversation to complex numbers, we're also going to open up the conversation to polynomials that have non-real roots. So what is a complex number? In some sense, it's in the name. A complex number is a number that consists of two parts. And so that's kind of the word complex. And those two parts are, and I'm going to write them in different colors, the real part and the imaginary part. So in order to talk about complex numbers, we have to have this notion of an imaginary number. So actually, before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and define the imaginary number. So definition. The imaginary number I, so I is the notation for the imaginary number. It's typically written in sort of cursive, and it is the number whose square is -1. So in other words, I squared is -1. This is how we define the imaginary number I. You will sometimes see I written as the square root of -1. I prefer not to write that. It doesn't feel like really good notation to me, so you will hear me say that I is the number whose square is -1. Acknowledge that this feels uncomfortable. Like, acknowledge that as far as kind of maybe your experience is concerned, there isn't a number whose square is -1. And what that discomfort comes from is the fact that really most of the time that we've ever talked about numbers, we've only talked about real ones. So that's okay. We are opening up our horizons and we're allowing for this new possibility. So now back to complex numbers. A complex number is a number that has two parts. We call the real part of a complex number A. Just because we have to call it something, I suppose. So we tend to call it A. And then the imaginary part of a complex number is actually the number B, and it is the number of i's that our complex number contains. So the real part of the complex number is the purely real piece of it, and the imaginary part of a complex number tells us what is the coefficient of I in this complex number. So here are some examples. So here's an example of a complex number, 7. So you might be thinking to yourself, 7, that's a whole number. How is that complex? Well, this is where we realize every single number we've encountered so far has actually been a complex number that's just been purely real. So I'm going to write here, this is a purely real complex number. So the real part of it is 7. So the real part, or A, is 7, and the imaginary part, or B, is 0. So it actually turns out that complex numbers contain the real numbers in them. All right, let's look at another complex number. How about this? How about 3i? Okay? So this is on the other side of the spectrum. This is the number that is purely imaginary. So it's a purely imaginary complex number. So if we were to talk about its real part and its imaginary part, the real part of this number is 0, right? It is purely imaginary, so it has no real part. And the imaginary part is 3. Okay? Let's look at a maybe more conventional example. What if we have 7 minus 2i? Okay. So you could pause the video here and take a moment to write down what are the real and imaginary parts of this number. Okay, so oops, this is not a purely imaginary number. Let's erase that. So this is a complex number with both a real and an imaginary part. Okay, so the real part here is 7, and the imaginary part is -2. Okay, so I really hope that I can encourage you to think of complex numbers as sort of these two-part things, real part, imaginary part, A and B. And I want us to be thinking about this when we start talking about the basics of working with complex numbers. So, towards the end of this video, let's look at a couple of examples of adding complex numbers. And of course, I hope you remember, we've discussed this. Addition and subtraction are essentially the same operation. So in this example, we'll look at some adding and some subtracting of complex numbers. So let's say that I have the number 7 plus 5i. That'll be my first complex number, and I'm adding 4 minus 2i. Okay? Now, complex numbers are often denoted with the letter Z. This is something I'm going to go into in more detail in a future video. But what you'll sometimes see when you're talking about more than one complex number is you'll see one of them called Z sub 1 and the other one called Z sub 2. And when you go to add two complex numbers, you'll notice that you're just going to add the real parts and add the imaginary parts. So 7 plus 4 is 11. 5 plus -2 is 3. Okay? So some of you will say, oh, this feels a lot like combining like terms almost. And it sort of is exactly that. You are adding the real parts together and you are adding the imaginary parts together. So let's do another example. Let's say that my first complex number is 4 minus 5i. So we'll call this Z sub 1. And then let's say that I'm subtracting the complex number 2 plus 3i. Okay? Now you'll notice that I put parentheses around the number that I'm subtracting because I want to make sure you understand you're subtracting that whole number. And what you're going to notice when it comes to subtracting complex numbers, you're going to subtract the real parts and subtract the imaginary parts. So you have 4 minus 2 is 2. Okay. And then negative 5i minus 3i is negative 8. So I guess we could summarize this by saying that if you have the complex number a1 plus b1i, so that's our first complex number, plus a2 plus b2i. So again, the real parts are the a's and the imaginary parts are the b's. When you're adding two complex numbers, you add the real parts and you add the imaginary parts. So I don't need to write a separate summary for subtraction because subtraction and addition are virtually the same operation and the same thing happens. You subtract the real parts and you subtract the imaginary parts. Okay, that's the first lesson on complex numbers where we introduce just the basics. What is a complex number? Introducing the imaginary number I. In our next video, we'll start talking about some operations on imaginary and complex numbers.